6 people were murdered on a remote Bavarian farm. The killer stayed for days, feeding the cattle, eating the food, sleeping under the same roof as the bodies. And then, they simply walked away. Never caught, never identified. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck Murders. There is a detail about this case that will stay with you long after this video ends. It is not the bodies. It is not the weapon. It is something investigators found when they finally arrived at that farm. Something that rewrote everything they thought they understood about what had happened there. And we will get to it. But first, you need to understand what kind of place Hinterkaifeck was and why it was the perfect place for something like this to happen. It is the spring of 1922. Rural Bavaria. A country that has just survived a world war, lost it, and is now bleeding out economically. The Weimar Republic is 9 months old and already struggling. People are hungry, desperate, moving through the countryside, looking for work, for food, for anything. In a landscape like that, a remote farm with no close neighbors is not just isolated. It is invisible. The Gruber family had lived at Hinterkaifeck for years. Andreas Gruber, 63 years old. His wife, Cecilia, 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabrielle, 35. Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. And the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44 years old. Maria had only arrived at the farm that day, her very first day. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. In the weeks before the murders, Andreas Gruber had been telling people about something strange. Footprints in the snow, leading from the forest to the farm, but none leading back out. A newspaper that no one at the farm had ordered, found lying in the yard. And the previous maid, the one Maria was replacing, had quit weeks earlier, claiming the farmhouse was haunted. The most disturbing part, though, is still ahead. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, someone led the Gruber family, one by one, into the barn. Andreas first, then Cecilia, then Victoria, then little 7-year-old Cecilia. They were each killed with a mattock, a heavy farm tool, something like a pickaxe, the kind of thing you would find in any barn, on any farm, anywhere in Bavaria. The blows were powerful, deliberate, and the forensic evidence would later suggest that little Cecilia did not die immediately. She pulled clumps of her own hair out, possibly in the time between the other murders and her own. Hours may have passed. Inside the house, 2-year-old Joseph was killed in his crib. Maria Baumgartner was killed in her bedroom. Her first night on the job. Her last night on Earth. 6 people. 1 weapon. 1 night. And then, silence. What investigators found when they finally arrived at that farm would make no sense for decades. The murders were not discovered for 4 days. 4 days. In that time, a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer became concerned. He had reasons to check on the farm that were personal, reasons we will get to. But he also simply noticed that the family had not been seen. The farm had gone quiet. On April 4th, 1922, he and 2 other neighbors walked up to Hinterkaifeck. The cattle were fed. The house was warm. Someone had been cooking. The mail from the previous days had been brought inside from the mailbox. The neighbors went to the barn first, and that is where they found them. Andreas, Cecilia Sr., Victoria, and young Cecilia, covered in hay. Inside, they found Josef in his crib, and Maria in her room. Lorenz Schlittenbauer pulled the bodies from under the hay himself, which was unusual, which investigators would note. But here is where it gets stranger. The local gendarmerie arrived, followed eventually by a Munich detective. The case quickly drew significant attention. 6 murders in rural Bavaria was not something that happened every day. But from the very beginning, the investigation was plagued by problems. The crime scene had been disturbed. Neighbors and curious locals had already walked through the farm before any systematic processing could happen. Evidence that might have told them exactly who had been in that house for 4 days after the murders, footprints, fingerprints, traces of a meal, was already contaminated or destroyed. The lead investigator, Georg Gruber, a detective from Munich, interviewed hundreds of people across the surrounding villages. He built a picture of the Gruber family, and it was a complicated one. Andreas Gruber had a reputation as a difficult man. Stubborn, argumentative. He had been investigated years earlier for incest, a criminal charge in Bavaria at the time, with his own daughter Victoria. Joseph, the 2-year-old, was rumored to be the child not of Victoria's dead husband, but of Andreas himself. This was not a family without enemies. This was not a family without secrets. If you have a theory forming already, keep it in mind. I will ask you about it at the end. Gruber's team examined the mattock used as the murder weapon. It belonged to the farm. It had been hanging in the barn. Whoever did this did not bring a weapon with them, or if they did, they chose not to use it and picked up something already there instead. The kills were close range, physical, requiring strength, and they were organized. 6 people, in multiple locations, with no one raising an alarm loud enough to be heard by anyone outside. The farmhouse was isolated enough that screaming would not carry to another property. But still, 6 people, no surviving witnesses, no one who escaped or ran. Gruber could not place a specific suspect at the scene. He had suspects, more than he could count, but none he could prove. And then the investigation hit a wall that in the chaos of post-war Germany, hyperinflation, political instability, an entire country coming apart at the seams, it never fully climbed back over. But the most disturbing part of this case is still ahead. Let us talk about what investigators kept circling back to and what kept defying explanation. Someone lived in that house for 4 days after 6 people were murdered. Think about that. Not for hours. Not overnight. 4 days. The cattle were fed regularly. This was not a one-time act. This was a routine, maintained over multiple days. Livestock need feeding every day. Whoever stayed there knew how. They were comfortable on a farm, and they were comfortable enough in the presence of death, or at least in the presence of knowing that death was 50 feet away in the barn, to wake up each morning and go about the work. Food was eaten from the kitchen. Forensic examination of the house confirmed that meals had been prepared and consumed after the time of death. The mail. Someone took the mail from the box by the road and brought it inside the house. Why? This is a detail that has no clean answer. Was it to delay discovery? Was it out of some bizarre habit? Was the killer so embedded in the routine of that farm that they simply could not stop acting like a resident? There were signs that someone had slept in the house, in a bed, in a house with 6 bodies. This is not the behavior of a panicked criminal who killed and fled. This is not a robbery gone wrong, not a single explosion of violence followed by running. This is something else, something colder, something that suggests either a mind operating completely outside normal human fear, or a person so familiar with the farm, so entitled to be there, that murder did not change their relationship to the place. Investigators also returned to those footprints Andreas had reported weeks before the murders. Prints in the snow leading to the farm, with none leading back. A newspaper no one ordered, the previous maid leaving because she felt the house was haunted. Taken together, This suggests the killer may have been surveilling the property, possibly even staying in outbuildings for weeks before the murders. Planning, watching, waiting for a specific moment, or simply working up to it. The weapon was never definitively identified as the murder weapon because the blood pattern and forensic techniques of 1922 could only confirm so much. The mattock was the likeliest candidate, but without modern forensics, certainty was impossible. In 2007, the skulls of 4 of the victims were sent to the State Criminal Office in Munich for modern forensic analysis. They had been in storage, used in the original investigation, kept for decades. This analysis confirmed the mattock as the probable weapon and produced new insights into the timing and sequence of the murders. But it did not produce a name. Now let us talk about who these people were. Because in the decades of fascination with this case, in the theories and the documentaries and the books, the 6 people who died at Hinterkaifeck have sometimes become characters in a puzzle rather than human beings who were alive on the morning of March 31st, 1922. Andreas Gruber was 63 years old. He was a farmer, and farming in that region in that era was hard, physical, unforgiving work. He was known to be proud and private, a man who settled his own problems. When he noticed those footprints in the snow, those signs that someone was watching his property, he told his neighbors. He was clearly frightened, or at least unsettled. But he did not leave. He stayed. Cecilia Gruber was 72 years old. She had lived that land for most of her life. She and Andreas had built something in Hinterkaifeck, even if it was built on pain. Victoria Gabriel was 35. She had lost her husband during the war. She was raising 2 children in a household with a complicated, possibly criminal history. She had almost no resources outside of that farm. She was trapped by circumstance in a place that would kill her. 7-year-old Cecilia had pulled out her own hair. She had been alive in that barn long enough to know what had happened around her, long enough to be afraid. Josef was 2 years old. Maria Baumgartner had a sister. Her sister would spend years struggling to understand why Maria died on her first night at a farm she had never been to before. Maria had taken the job because she needed work. She was a woman trying to live her life in a country that was barely functioning. She could not have known what she was walking into. Their families grieved in a Germany that was collapsing around them. There were no grief counselors, no victim support services, no media campaigns for justice. There was just absence, sudden, violent, unexplained absence, and a world that could not afford to stop moving. Now, the theories. There are 3 that have endured, 3 that investigators in 1922 and researchers since have treated as genuinely possible. The first centers on Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was one of the neighbors who discovered the bodies. He was the one who pulled them from under the hay. He had a personal connection to the Gruber family that ran deep. Many believed he was the real father of little Joseph, and he had been in a relationship with Victoria that had turned bitter and complicated. He had reason to feel wronged. He had reason to want something from that family. And his behavior at the crime scene was, by the accounts of those present, strange. He touched the bodies. He disturbed the scene. He showed emotion that some witnesses described as grief, and others described as something harder to name. He was interviewed multiple times. He gave accounts that shifted slightly. He knew the farm. He knew how to care for cattle. He was physically capable of the violence. But he was never charged. And here is the doubt. Discovering bodies and handling them in a state of shock, even if the emotion driving that shock is complicated, does not make a person a murderer. Lorenz Schlittenbauer lived for years in the community afterward. He died in 1941, having never been formally accused. The second theory points to a drifter or vagrant. Post-war Bavaria was full of them. men displaced by the war, by poverty, by the total collapse of the social order, moving through the countryside, looking for shelter, food, work. The theory suggests that someone found the outbuildings at Hinterkaifeck weeks earlier, possibly began living in them, was discovered or feared discovery, and killed the family to protect themselves, to protect whatever small, brutal foothold they had found. This would explain the footprints that appeared without return tracks. It would explain the stolen newspaper. It would explain why someone comfortable with farm labor stayed behind after the murders, because the farm was already home. There is something almost unbearably dark about this version. A faceless, nameless person, barely surviving at the edges of society, choosing to kill an entire family rather than walk back out into the cold, and then living among what they had done, because the cold outside was worse. The doubt here is scale. Killing 6 people, including 2 children, maintaining control over an entire farm, doing it without a single witness. Is that the act of someone improvising their survival? Or does it require something more specific, something more personal? The third theory is one that was largely ignored in early investigations, but has gained traction with modern researchers. A traveling craftsman or handyman named Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. The man everyone assumed was dead. Carl Gabriel had been reported killed in action during World War I. But the chaos of that war meant that thousands of soldiers listed as dead had in fact survived, changed identities, drifted. Some researchers have examined the possibility that Carl Gabriel returned, not officially, not warmly, but came back to a farm and a wife who had moved on, who had a child that was not his, who was entangled with Lorenz Schlittenbauer, that he came back with a rage that had been building across years of war and loss and abandonment. This theory has a kind of emotional logic, returning to reclaim something, finding it irretrievably changed. The violence of that mattock, close, physical, repeated, speaks to someone in a state of overwhelming personal fury. And if Carl Gabriel had survived the war under a different name, disappearing afterward would have been frighteningly easy in the chaos of 1922 Germany. The doubt is that there is no concrete evidence Carl Gabriel survived. The sighting reports are thin. The whole theory rests on the chaos of wartime record-keeping and the possibility of something for which no proof has ever been found. 3 theories, 3 possible faces behind the same crime, none of them ever proven. The Hinterkaifeck case was never officially solved. It remains one of the oldest and most studied cold cases in German criminal history. The farm itself was demolished in 1923, as if the land itself needed to be cleared of what had happened there. A small memorial now stands at the site. Somewhere in the cold archive of German legal history, the file still exists. Open. Unanswered. 6 people went into the dark on March 31, 1922, and whoever brought them there has never answered for it. The killer sat in that farmhouse, ate their food, slept in their beds, fed their cattle, and walked away into a century that never found them. So what do you think really happened? Who was responsible? Tell me your theory in the comments. I read every single one. Next week, we travel to a different country, a different decade, and a crime that investigators say should have been solved within 48 hours, but wasn't. Subscribe.